On January 14, 1953, Federal Express number 173 was running between Boston and Washington, D.C., carrying mail and passengers. The operation was run between the New Haven and Pennsylvania Railroad. The first run was made by a New Haven diesel destined to New Haven, Connecticut, and departed at 11 p.m. Once it reached the destination, the diesel was then swapped out with an electric engine, along with many more cars to consist. This train's next stop was the New York Penn Station, and once it reached the destination, the locomotive was then swapped out again with the Pennsylvania Railroad GG1, numbered 4876. This would be the last time the locomotive was switched, as 4876 was destined for DC. The train had around 16 cars, with many sleeper cars, also known as Pullmans, and the train was carrying around 400 passengers. The Federal Express would depart around 4:38 a.m. from New York City, heading towards Washington, with a couple of scheduled stops like Philadelphia, Wilmington, and Baltimore. Everything seemed to go smoothly. No signs of malfunctions or anything reported. Baltimore was the last stop before Washington and departed at 7:50 a.m. The train now started to pick up speed at around 80 miles per hour, which was the normal track speed. The train would soon slow the train's entrance into Washington once it reached Landover, Maryland, and the engineer Henry W. Brower would apply the brakes to slow the train. However, it would only slow down to 60 miles per hour, which was double the amount of speed he needed to approach into DC. So then, he tried a different approach and applied the emergency brakes. However, that did not help either, as it only slowed the train down to 50 miles per hour. Brower tried anything he could do to slow down the train, even putting it in reverse, but it got worse, as there was a lot of stress being placed on 4876, and it started to malfunction, and sparks started to fly out under the wheels from the locomotive and some of the coaches. It only got worse as the train started descending a 5,500 foot stretch of track on a 0.73% grade, which started to accelerate the train more. Brower lost control of the train as there was nothing more he could do, but in an act of desperation he blasted the Leslie A200 air horn of 4876 as a last-ditch effort. At the train yard, John Keeney and K Tower switched the Federal Express onto track 16, but as the train roared past the tower, Keeney telephoned the station master's office. The one who picked up was Kirk Ray Klopp. Keeney shouted there was a runaway on track 16, and as Klopp looked up, he saw the train thundering across the line towards the station. He then picked up a PA microphone telling people to run for their lives, and he got out of there as fast as he could along with several other clerks and bystanders, with only around 20 seconds left. Aboard the train, Conductor Thomas J. Murphy ran from car to car, telling passengers to get as low as they can on the floor or under their seats and brace for impact, as there was no time left. The train passed many signals and many bends, which surprisingly didn't derail the train and slowed the train down a bit, but there was nothing else to stop the train. The train first destroys the buffer stop and keeps on going through the station, destroying the station master's office and the newsstands. The train began to tilt to its right, also destroying a steel pillar in the concourse. The floor, not designed to carry the weight of a train, was destroyed and collapsed under the 475-pound or 215.5-ton locomotive, causing it to fall into the basement. A few coaches also came loose from the locomotive and separated from the train, where one slid right next to the engine on the concourse and the other fell behind the engine into the basement. The train was just inches from the crowded waiting room further down the concourse. Fortunately, no fatalities happened in the accident, but 43 people sustained injuries, with 6 needing overnight hospitalization. The workers in the basement just a few minutes or even seconds ago just departed for their coffee break, which was a miracle that they got out there safely. Both the lead engineer and fireman didn't get badly hurt, with the engineer sustaining no injuries. The fireman only had a few scratches, and some of the Union Station workers were trapped in the wreckage, but were rescued. In the wreckage was the station master's clock, and it was stopped at the time the train crashed, 8:38 a.m. A broadcast by NBC News was underway just 67 minutes after the wreck. At this time, this was one of the fastest live recorded broadcasts ever filmed. Before investigators could get a lead on what happened, there was one major problem. In 5 days was the inauguration of a newly elected president. In this case, it was the 34th President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a well-known general that served in World War II and was behind many of the operations during the war. They could take the coaches away, but the GG1 would be time-consuming to take out. So what they did was to build a false floor over the locomotive, which meant there would be a giant GG1 in the basement in the span of a few days. The plan was underway, with the coaches being taken away, and a construction company called Steiner Construction built a temporary wood floor over the giant hole, and the entire thing was covered in quick-drying asphalt. The company even built a temporary station master's office and newsstand. The construction of the floor and everything else was successful, and thankfully everything was temporarily built on time for the inauguration. Once January 20th came, several people came by train to Washington to see the inauguration of Dwight D. Eisenhower. After the inauguration, the temporary construction was taken off and 4876 was cut up, and it was then taken to Altoona Yards where it was repaired. Now, what went wrong and how did this runaway happen? Well, when the train departed Boston at 11 p.m., it had to make a stop at Kingston, Rhode Island. The brakes were sticking and a 45-minute inspection occurred, and the conductors found a closed angle cock or an air shutoff valve at the rear end of the third car. The air brake system was found to have angle cocks at both ends of each car, and both valves had to be opened properly for the air brake system to work. The one with the closed valve would only be at the back of the engine and at the front of the locomotive. The air brake system was operated by compressed air reservoir on each car, and the engine supplies air pressure that should flow through the air brake system along the entire train. Once the pressure is reduced, the valves on each car causes compressed air to flow through the brake cylinders, which applies the brake shoes and begins to slow down the train. If the cars are separated or the air pressure is dumped by the engineer, then the pressure immediately stops and everything will automatically go into emergency braking, which acts as a failsafe. If the valve is closed at any point on the train, the system is disabled and it can't allow any reduction in air pressure to apply the brakes. Once the train got to New York City, the inspectors found that the valve was in the correct shape, but the ICC conducted an after-accident investigation and it shows the rear valve on the third coach was not in position. A flaw of New Haven coach 8665 allowed the handle of the valves to come into contact with the coupler, which closes off the valve. That meant the engine could only apply braking power to the first 3 coaches, but the rest of the train was cut off because of this one closed valve. Now let's get back to Pennsylvania Railroad 4876, as its story was not ended there. After it was repaired, it returned to service, and it even had a very lengthy work life of around 30 to 40 years, where in 1976 it was acquired by Penn Central, where it worked for the company until being passed again to Conrail. It even worked for New Jersey Transit under NJ Dot, and it kept the same number throughout all the years. It was retired in 1983, and it's still one of the surviving GG1s being preserved by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Museum, but is in pretty bad shape from the rust and even vandalism. Even after all these years, this wreck has been pretty forgotten about, but the legacy still lives on and is still considered one of the most sensational runaway trains in American history. It still remains alive today if it wasn't for 4876.